welcome to this episode of the India Revival Mission. I'm Nayantara Rai, working from home. Our guest today on India Revival Mission is the India head of Accenture, Piyush Singh. We're going to be discussing with him how corporates and businesses have been aligning and realigning themselves thanks to the Blackswan event of 2020, COVID-19, the disruptions that have resulted in business models perhaps changing forever. Thank you so much for joining us here on Times Network's India Revival Mission. Accenture, of course, one of the largest global consultancy firms. You have domestic clients, you have multinational clients. How have the last couple of months been for you? You had to, from day one, perhaps, give the best possible advice.
Well, very happy to be here indeed, Nayantara. Thank you for having me. The last few months have been surreal to start with, no less surreal for us than it has been for anybody else. Yes, we have been on a voyage of discovery, as has been our clients, as have been our colleagues and societies at large. In that voyage of discovery, I would say we've gone through multiple stages. I mean, there was a stage one where everybody was wanting to prepare for a bit of a pause, and a pause of waiting while letting this what was hopefully a short storm pass by. So it was a period of putting the protection and the hunkers down, right, and putting the anchor down and staying calm and still for a bit. I think from then we went on to an understanding very clearly that this was a longer term challenge, and therefore also the fact that it was a challenge that will have its ebbs and flows. So from being anchored down, or in a bit of a pause mode, to a very different mode of a high resilience. Right? How do you go up with potential spurts in demands, but then how do you go back down in case of a sudden increase in the infection rate of the pandemic? And I think then there is also now, hopefully with some sight of the end of the pandemic and hope of end of the pandemic, starting to look at how do you start to plan for the post-pandemic world. So I think those are the three stages, right? How do you help your clients to put a pause on their operations? How do you help them to become more resilient with what is a very wavy, up and down curve? And then how do you start to plan for a world that is going to emerge post the pandemic?
Great. So, having set the stage for that, let's talk about all of this in details. I think the word BC will never mean the same again. It's perhaps for all of us going to mean before Corona, before COVID. But tell me something. For the after Corona world, are you already seeing your clients and businesses starting to prepare for that event? We are hearing such positive news, for example, about vaccines. The Indian Prime Minister is holding meetings with state chief ministers and senior government functionaries for the administration of vaccines. So it does seem that it's going to happen sooner than later. So with that event round the corner, are you seeing businesses prepare for the post-Corona world?
Yeah, I do believe that the business, look, the pandemic period itself, through the period itself, there has been a tier of organizations that have emerged, organizations that increasingly became aware that they will come out of the pandemic world likely relatively stronger to their peers, because they may have gone in better prepared, they may have gone in at a better position in their business, in their personal organizational cycle or their industry cycle. And there are businesses that would not be so. So those businesses that we are working with in the first category have surely started to plan for that post-pandemic world. And I think the biggest plan that they are looking to do is to ascertain how has the consumer preference or the preference of their consumer, whether that consumer is an individual or an organization, changed irreversibly as a result of this period of a very different way of living. And therefore, what kind of reinvention do they need to undertake for their organization to be able to be relevant in that, post irreversible change?
Pardon me for sounding so generic with my next question, but when the pandemic broke down and you started seeing lockdowns around the world, with India perhaps enforcing the strictest lockdown on this planet, caution was the word of the game, right? But since then, there has been a bounce back in the economy. You have seen a bounce back in consumption. There has been an acceleration in adopting technology, in companies accelerating their digital processes, and all of that. Are you still seeing businesses and the corporate world remaining cautious, or have they started to take risks?
Well, first of all, I commend you for putting a rather profound question in the guise of a generic question. That's there. But no, look, I do not believe that that the I wouldn't say caution, but a little bit of deliberation can go away from any organization, right now. There is a world out there now that is going to be quite different from the world that we went into during the onset of the pandemic, right? So I do think, how do you discover what that new shape of demand will look like? How do you discover what the new preference or the new evolved preference of your consumer looks like? I will require a little bit more of deliberation. Also, please be mindful that whilst we are all very grateful, that demands from the levels of a low pandemic or a shutdown world are definitely up many-fold. There are not that many organizations that are sitting on business demand or business performance that has gone back to a pre-pandemic expansion of their business. And businesses had planned for a growth. We are a very growth-centric economy. So I definitely cannot take away from the fact that there is a bounce back from the lows, but I think the business leaders will feel much more buoyant once they start to see a path to going back to a growth structure or a growth in demand compared to where they had left.
It's a fantastic point that you're making, and we should not forget either that India is an economy which is primarily services driven. Yes, the government is trying to make it Atmanirbhar, self-reliant, give a fillip to manufacturing, but it doesn't change the fact that it's a services-led economy. It also doesn't change the fact that the savings rate, for example, in India is very high, and we're still trying to get discretionary spend to come back. In a lot of sectors, it might be back to where we were pre-COVID, maybe higher, but the challenge still exists. So can you give us an idea of how clients, corporate India, are reorienting themselves around that?
Yes, look, I think, as I said earlier, the key thing is going to be to figure out, for my customer base, what has changed and what is the level of demand that is going to come back. Now, this will require, a new way of working. Why a new way of working? Because typically, in the past, you relied on your frontline workforce instinct or your management instinct to be able to start to factor this into your business plan. Now, in this world, those instincts don't necessarily apply, because one thing that all the greats have all said this before me, that the pandemic has accelerated the digital the general preference of digital consumption of goods and services by many fold in a very short period of time. Now, that has got a profound impact on business models of all organizations. right? So when you are going to look at that, you will have to now increasingly rely on data and and data based insights to drive the decision making of where your business has to go in the future. Your instincts will always be valued, but they are slightly less relevant or slightly less perfect in this kind of world where the past is very different to where we are in the future or we are in today. So I think the first thing is to make sure that you are relying on a on a universe of data because as the digital consumption increases, we as consumers, organizations as consumers, are all leaving what we call much stronger digital footprints everywhere around. So, how do you as an organization pick up those digital footprints of your consumers and start to analyze them to understand what is the new emerging demand pattern, what is the new emerging demand preference, so that you can reinvent your product, your services in line with that? Does that make sense?
Yes, of course, it makes sense. And I think the trick will also be to figure out how much we will revert to the pre COVID world, how much consumer pattern behavior has changed forever. So, for example, office space. We don't know as yet how many offices will go back to the kind of operations they had pre corona. A lot of them are saving costs, admin costs. Do they need that kind of real estate? Are employees as productive as they were pre corona as they are working from home? Can you tell us what it is that India Inc. and the corporate world is thinking at the moment? Work from home, what's the future?
Right. So, look, I would say two parts. I think when you look at thinking, most people are definitely wanting to explore what does the future mix of virtual digital work versus physical workspace look like, right? I do not see hearing back from India Inc. as much a clear vision for it, but a definite strong exploration and deliberation. What my advice to our business leaders is, this is not a work from home opportunity. This is a work from anywhere opportunity, right? Why? Because if we are going to be able to do work from anywhere, it unlocks a huge amount of new opportunities for changing the talent mix of our organization. Our geographic location, our reach of across that geographic location has been a very strong factor on the kind of talent mix that we can get in our organization. If we are buying the fact that the future requires quite a lot of reinvention of our business model to respond to a more digital savvy customer, then we will have to revisit our talent mix quite sharply. If we want to do that at pace, we cannot be tied down necessarily by geographic proximity of available talent. So I would therefore say the opportunity is, how can we reinvent our ways of working so that we can truly work in a digital way, right? And therefore make it a work from anywhere environment so that we can then have people we can source people from wherever there is talent in terms of geography, and then at the same time deploy them in our organization. If I may add, the one thing that I will say is, if we in this ways of working, again, we have got two stages. Stage one was what I call stealth. All of us as committed colleagues of our, or committed employees of our organizations, when the pandemic came down, we hunkered down and made sure that we used whatever digital tools were given in order to go back and start working. That does not necessarily mean that our workspaces were designed for digital collaboration. They were designed for being able to work virtually on a sustained basis. So in my view, the opportunity that this presents can only be unlocked if organizations do go from that moment of stealth to a moment of restructuring, where they do transform their workplace to be where digital collaboration and digital working is possible, not just remote working from home.
So therefore, if I could read between the lines of what you're saying and, the prevalent trend at the moment, the hybrid work from home model, something the United States tech companies have been doing for many years, is that the future for Indian companies?
Yeah, almost certainly. Hybrid work model is here to stay. Is the value that Indian organizations must unlock, and it has to be hybrid because I believe that you will require a level of physical connect with your workforce for them to have a stronger sense of belonging and connect with the brand. You can't go completely virtual. So yeah, I mean, in my view, but this is not just this is the hybrid work model is not, it can be very efficient, but efficient in terms of productivity, in terms of cost, but also must be seen as a great opportunity to source talent that may have not been possible to source earlier by those organizations. But if
Can
I
I
may
also ask you
add,
that, at least as far as the global clients go? Yes, please go ahead.
no, I was saying, sorry, I beg your pardon. If I may add also, as you start to design as you said, the hybrid work environment, you will also have to be very mindful of local nuances, right? Because, you know, there are values that may be there in certain places for the hybrid work environment that the work environment offers that may not be there in others. I mean, like, for example, there are cities in India where the avoidance of travel is a virtue that can be offered, by allowing people not to do that, make that travel to a same fixed location every day if it can be avoided. That's on one side. But on the other side, not everybody may have the sanctity of a work environment or the possibility for that to exist at their home location. So how do you balance that, right? There are, dare I say, there are very clear gender biases about the levels of responsibility and domestic responsibilities that that the women at workplace are having to carry when they are having to work from home on sustained basis. So how do you balance that, with the upside of being able to avoid the pains of office travel, the ability to have greater time for productivity, etc., is something. Those are the local nuances that each organization will have to consider.
So the supply chain blockages, the bottlenecks, they have, started to go away since the lockdown was lifted in the unlocking phase, all of that. So as that is taking place as well, can I ask you, what are the top technology bets that companies in India need to take?
Look, I think the top technology bets, I would say, first and foremost is data. How do you ensure that you have got access to data that is associated with your consumer and with your supply chain in order to be a data-driven organization for decision making. So data is definitely the first and the big technology bet. The second technology bet, I would say, is how do you transform your underlying business process capability to be digitally native? What does that mean? It means that how do you ensure that you are using technology platforms that are cloud native, that are built to be able to increase the speed of change, or the speed at which you can change, and that are designed for a digitally native world. So that's the second part. So first and foremost, data. The second is how do you create a digitally native technology infrastructure, right? Read that as cloud, read that as digitally native applications, right? And of course, as you do that, you will have to make sure that you are building the surrounding infrastructure to be able to exist in this data driven cloud native world, which means you'll have to up your investment in the area of security, you'll have to up your investment in the area of the quality of digital interface that you build, and you'll have to up most drastically the investment in increasing the technology competence of your management team, because management teams have not had to think as technology savvy or as technology led in their thinking as they will have to be in the future. So that's the third, that's the one leg of the investment that may not come intuitively, but we must make sure that that is at the top of every board's agenda.
Okay, so with that piece of advice, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out, for joining us here on Times Network's India Revival Mission, and for being so candid.
Happy to be here, as I said, and stay safe, and hopefully we can go back to meeting in person sometime in the future.
Really looking forward to that. Thank you once again.